Great. Thanks everyone who's joining us on LinkedIn. Thanks everyone who's joining us on this webpage. I'm going to turn it over to our gurus from Inevitable Policy Response in a moment. I'm just filling in gap to make sure you understand you're in the right place while we let people log in. I'm Sean Kidney from the CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative. Give us a couple of minutes more. And by the way, panelists, feel free to chat amongst yourselves, knowing everyone can listen to every single word. We're just still in the introductory phases.
How is the weather where everybody is today? Sean, I'll start with you.
Well done, Tanya. That's a good conversation starter. And bear with us, everyone, while we discuss the weather for a minute. Here it's cold winterish spring has arrived in London. How about you?
Mild and sunny in New York.
Well, it was 37 degrees centigrade here in Sydney, where I am. It's nearly midnight here. So, but it was a hot day and it's just mid-October. So I'm forecasting a 50 degrees centigrade day sometime in our summer.
The delightful future we have to look forward to.
We have about 15 degrees in London. It's quite a nice day, a bit drizzly though.
We are about in Sevilla, South Spain, about 30 degrees. So the summer is still going on.
The endless summer. It was a wonderful teenage mantra in the old days. It's now becoming a little bit of a not so attractive idea. But maybe we might use that as a cue to get going, Mark, simply to say, you all know that climate change is impacting us. You all know that things are getting ugly. You've heard that the World Meteorological Organization says we're going to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2027 at the latest, if not sooner. Our challenge now will be to get emissions back down, etc. Well, the Inevitable Policy Response covers, canvasses, explores a lot of these issues in its full modelling. The challenge is, what do we do about it? But in the meantime, what's actually our realistic option? And what are the various wedges of change that could work for us, and understanding that? That's the point of today's webinar on the bioenergy in focus, the bridge between land energy systems in climate transition. And as you can see, star-studded cast. At that point, over to Mark Fulton.
Hello, everyone. So I'm Mark Fulton, and I'm the founder of the Inevitable Policy Response back in 2018. If we will look at the first slide. Next one, thanks. So we were commissioned by the UNPRI to have a look at the climate transition risk from a realistic standpoint, and look at it as investors would need to look at it in terms of actually portfolio construction rather than a stress test. We have a research consortium, my group, Energy Transition Advisors, Thea Finance, Jacob Tume, and NGO partners, of course, including Climate Bonds. We have strategic partners from the market, some of the well-known players there, Fitch Ratings, BNP will be joining us today, and Temasek. Our core philanthropic support is from the Betty Moore Foundation and the Finance Hub, particularly interested in land use and therefore the bioenergy work, and the Climate Works Foundation has also been important to us. So what do we actually do on the next slide? We basically forecast. I mean, that's what you do if you are in the financial markets looking ahead. You have to take a view or no view, but it's a view if you don't have a view. So essentially, we actually make 300 what we call high conviction policy forecasts, 21 countries, 10 policy areas across energy and land. And that leads to a fully integrated climate and nature scenario model, which is run for us by Jason and his group at Vivid. And essentially, you can see that it's fairly comprehensive. And I think importantly, we show how bioenergy sits between the land and energy systems. And that's why this year we made a special focus on bioenergy. Obviously, it's unusual to see land get as much coverage as we do in the IPR. We really go into the land in great detail. So we wanted to show exactly in even greater detail how it fitted in with energy through bioenergy. So we model it, we produce what we call value drivers across all these sectors. And we have various people that are using them in applications, Fitch, Morningstar, Pacta, Planetrix, and so on. So we offer our data in a public sense for users. So on the next slide, I want to just start the point about bioenergy, why it's so important. It really is the bridge between land and energy, but it faces these difficult trade-offs. It faces a lot of competition, and it highlights the competition in land and across the energy and land systems. And it highlights the very sensitive areas that policymakers are going to have a lot of pay a lot of attention to. So already within the land system, it's competing with food, materials, and biodiversity, which we call nature. And again, you know, we have a biodiversity module within the modeling, which is unusual. And that allows us to look at the impacts that are taking place there. So then obviously bioenergy itself can produce low carbon energy competing with or sometimes compatible with the energy system itself. And then the negative emissions that can come out of bioenergy when it's combined with carbon capture and storage. And that, of course, is bioenergy CCS, which had a lot of hope for it. Many years ago in particular, it was a very big dominant part of climate modeling, and it has diminished as people have begun to realize just how careful you have to be about it. But that bioenergy itself competes with direct air capture, something that we're really looking at very closely at IPR. And in November, we'll have a series of papers emerging on direct air capture. And of course, within the land system, nature-based solutions like afforestation. So essentially, that's where it fits in. That's how it's got to sort of evolve, and it has to make sure that it doesn't provide anomalies and competition that are going to be big problems. So obviously improving yields, changing consumption habits, reduction of waste, these all help this competition. So on the next page, you can see why we go on about policy. We believe there are four major guardrails that policymakers are going to have to go along and will go along and are starting to go along to make this work out in a way that will be optimal and sustainable. And these are the guardrails that we feel fit with the Climate Bonds Initiative discussions of what people should consider when it comes to climate bonds relating to bioenergy. So the first point is this point about nature. There's no nature displacement. Biodiversity has to be primary. It cannot give literally ground to bioenergy. So we exclude the land area in the world database on protected areas in our modeling. We assume that will be taken on. And we see an example of that with the 30 times 30 policy of at least 30% of land and oceans protected by 2030. Then no deforestation. We actually forecast an end to deforestation by 2030. Now, some people think that's very hopeful, but we think there are good signs of that. And that's why policy is coming into play on that. We obviously, again, do not want to see, and we do not believe policymakers will want to see biofuels encroaching on the forests. So again, the EU's Renewable Energy Directive does limit biofuels produced on previously high carbon land. There's an example of that. And then we get no food competition, and that's perhaps currently would be the most, so much of a challenge, because first generation bioenergy crops, such as corn for ethanol, do compete with food production. And therefore, at the moment, we see that that's something that governments will have to think about very carefully going forward. And we assume all areas are where the top is 30% of yields for the major maize, rice, wheat, and soybean will be excluded. So again, we look at Germany, we look at the UK, we look to Europe beginning to do that. We think that has to become something important. We can't take the current expansion in global population and compete with food. And then, in fact, finally, which might be, quite a strong one, no irrigation. Essentially, irrigation takes a lot of water, and there's a lot of water stress. So the last thing we want to do is to see loads of irrigation being used on biofuels. And we see some beginnings of that. So those are our guardrails. Those are what drive the model, which Jason's now about to start looking at the results. But in a sense, they're also a challenge to policymakers. We're forecasting they're going to do this, but they're going to need to do it. And if they don't do it and biofuels expand more than we expect, then there'll be a lot of unintended and nasty consequences. So on that note, I'll pass over to Jason.
Thank you, Mark. So let me start by just highlighting out of that broad overview, what do we derive as the key implications for investors? What are some of the key takeaways from the FPS 2023 on bioenergy? So I guess first, kind of synthesizing a little bit what Mark was saying, land scarcity implies, the sustainable sourcing policy will constrain where bioenergy comes from. Now, it's not necessarily will constrain bioenergy production. We'll talk a little bit about that in particular, but we'll constrain how and where bioenergy and bioenergy feedstocks are produced. Unabated biomass, in particular, plays a role quite limited to the high value and high sustainability opportunities, particularly aviation, shipping, and pulp and paper. But it's otherwise outcompeted, which is really a critical piece to the puzzle of what constrains bioenergy. So there's a land side to it, but as Mark pointed out, it's a land and energy technology. And actually the energy system and the extent of competition now from other sources of clean energy become a pretty critical constraint on how far we think bioenergy will go. In terms of supply streams, waste and residues are expected to make up a growing share of feedstock as the most sustainable alternative, particularly to the 1G crops that are currently common. But over time, 2G dedicated biomass crops will likely play a role, displacing what remains of kind of the 1G crops. All that said, however, given the extent of constraints, we don't see a large net increase in the amount of land dedicated to biomass, and we see it landing somewhere around 91 million hectares. BECCS does scale up significantly. So the importance of bioenergy to negative emissions, is strong enough in the IPR view that we see BECCS reach far greater scale than today, of course, around 1 gigaton of removals in power and cement, where the highest value might be. But its growth beyond that begins to be constrained as we see direct air capture come down in cost and provide a strong alternative for long run negative emissions. Right now, one of the key takeaways from this is there's a mismatch between where we see current bioenergy infrastructure and what's going to be needed long term as this transition moves forward. And the location and feedstock mismatches, could create investment opportunities and risks. So those are the key high level takeaways. I'll just walk through a few slides that help us dig into some of that. So we go to the next slide, please. No, the next one, sorry, one more. So when it comes to sources of bioenergy or biomass for bioenergy, there is a significant amount of waste and residues that are have high sustainability, good cost advantages, but are currently under leveraged. That moves across from waste oils, food waste, things often at the end of our consumption. It also includes livestock and crop residues earlier in the production process. But increasingly, there will be feedstocks that are incorporated into agricultural lands, which create essentially co-crops, particularly around cover crops and agroforestry. So there is a significant amount of these highly attractive sources of bioenergy or biomass to bioenergy. And they can get us to around 30 exajoules per year. Some of these are already obviously under significant development. We've seen a lot of movement on things like waste oils and fats, and there have been significant efforts, for example, in things like livestock residues and some crop residues. But across the board, they've not been leveraged to their full extent. And as you move to the right, in particular, the extent to which they, as a source of feedstocks, have been taken advantage of is lower and lower. Let's go to the next slide. In terms of non kind of waste and residue or co-crop opportunities, there is still a lot of land. So when you look at the overall world land cover and you even apply the guardrails that the FPS forecast policymakers to be putting in place, there actually remains a good deal of land that could potentially be suitable for dedicated biomass crops. In that sense, the amount of land isn't the constraining factor. However, when you look at the characteristics of the land, we'll look at some more of them in a second, both in terms of the opportunity cost for carbon. So some of this land could be used for other carbon capturing uses, particularly nature-based solutions. When you look at where the land is and how suitable it might be to a bioenergy stream, and when you look at how all those costs end up creating the relative competitiveness of bioenergy to alternative energy sources, that kind of technical potential is actually becomes much more limited when you look at what will be realized. So the guardrails make a big difference, but actually it's a series of factors that eventually lead to the FPS's forecast. So if we move to the next slide, one of the first things to note is that even though there is land available currently, we're a little bit mismatched in terms of where some of the potential feedstocks might be coming from and where a lot of the infrastructure is. So obviously the most significant infrastructure on biomass has been in Western Europe, North America, and tropical Latin America. However, they don't represent the lion's share of where sustainable dedicated crops might be sourced from. And as we know, a lot of them are currently dependent on first generation crops, which in the long run, the forecast sees as phasing out. So there's a significant shift when we think about the role of dedicated energy crops, some of which will be within region and some of which will potentially be across regions. Let's go to the next slide for a second. So on the constraints on the land side, you've got the guardrails, you've got potentially mismatches in location of use versus production, and you've got the alternative use for some of those 500 million hectares, particularly around MBS. And so when we look at what's available, its cost, and the possibility that it could be used for other things like nature restoration, we then have to look at how attractive does that look when you look at this alternative use for energy and or carbon removals. And let's go to the next slide to get to some of the detail. So in broad terms, even without too much of a trade-off, bioenergy has become less competitive or uncompetitive already in a number of uses that people were talking about only just a few years ago. So if we look at things like light-duty vehicles, heavy-duty vehicles, shipping, in general, alternatives have already either exceeded in terms of cost competitiveness, as with light-duty vehicles, or they're approaching it and are expected, according to the FPS, to pass bioenergy alternatives in terms of competitiveness by the 2030s, and then to increase that relative competitiveness over time. The major exception to this is aviation, where the cost advantage to bioenergy is expected to last much longer, and we'll come back to that in a second. And in pulp and paper, where the location and availability of residue and its suitability for the production process gives it a lasting cost advantage. But in many, many applications that we would have spoken about, not even 5 or so years ago, I think the competitiveness of bioenergy relative to alternatives has shifted dramatically, and that makes a big difference for how much bioenergy we would see. The last bucket, which is around negative emissions technologies, we'll talk about again in a second, but it's worth noting that all else equal, of course, the use of BECCS is generally more cost effective than the other options currently available. But what it does is it creates negative emissions, which have very, very significant value. And I guess it's those negative emissions and whether they're sufficiently significant that drives BECCS. And as I said at the beginning, they are, but to a certain limited extent. So let's keep going to dive into a few of these quickly, and then I'll pass back for discussion. One more slide, please. Great. So when we look at aviation, as I mentioned, currently biofuel pathways are much more competitive than the proposed kind of non-bio route or partial bio route pathway, which is synfuels. Synfuels remain quite immature. The expectation is that biofuels will continue to have an advantage for about 20 years, at least, with a lot of uncertainty around what role synfuels might play in over time and towards the late 2030s and 2040s. But the forecast is that advantage means biofuels will be a very significant source of low carbon fuel for aviation for a long time to come. If we move one more slide, looking at BECCS, this will be the last slide. And by the way, that previous story, goes for pulp and paper even more so. When it comes to BECCS, there are a couple of potential uses that have significant negative emissions and reasonable cost for the carbon sequestered, power and cement in particular. Currently, by way of the ability to do negative emissions at scale, they have a lower expected cost point, even though there's not much of that installed. But that cost advantage could very likely hold for a while as DAX gets below the cost curve. And the expectation is that there will be, to garner that negative emissions benefits, there will be significant build out over the course of time. This will take time, and one of the constraints on BECCS, even though its expected costs are lower, is of course it's subject to broader CCS supportive policy. It's subject to having the infrastructure for CCS built out in a cost competitive way, and it's subject to a large number of specific support policies which are only coming on now. So the rollout of this, even though it's relatively cost competitive, will be gradual over time according to the forecast, but will become significant. However, by the time we get to the late 2040s or the 2040s and the 2050s, DAX is expected to have come down in cost so much that the further development of negative emissions technologies will not rely on a BECCS or bioenergy pathway. It will sort of stay relatively flat, and we'll see by the kind of late 2030s and the 2040s the emergence of DAX as the higher growth, longer term at scale solution for negative emissions. So that's a summary of how bioenergy might unfold and what some of the key constraints are, and where we see it playing a role over the next 20 or 30 years. I stop there.
Thanks, Jason. That's really very interesting indeed. I mean, for our listeners, you'll be aware that 50% of renewable energy globally is currently from bioenergy. So this is a big chunk of what we're actually doing on the planet. But the modeling suggests we're going to have to change the makeup of that allocation of scarce land, in particular, scarce resource, what's going to become increasingly scarce going forward. And that's the key thing for investors to understand. The makeup of bioenergy will change, will have to change to meet our criteria, but some areas are going to work. I mean, it is worth noting that in the sustainable aviation fuels, we now have a very progressive policy in Europe, where the European Commission has introduced subsidies for SAFs for 2030, mandates for airports to be able to provide sustainable aviation fuels, and so on. We can expect to see some significant changes. We've seen in shipping the first commissioning of biomethane super ships by Maersk. There is this debate, as Jason points out, between biomethane and ammonia. And ammonia looks like it's got the cost advantage over time. But in the meantime, biomethane's getting out of the road because we're still sorting out safety issues and practicality issues around ammonia. And last week I was at a plant in Japan examining the tests in this area. And we're not there yet, even though it looks very good. But one thing is for certain, the terrestrial transport use of bioenergy, hey, this has got to change, right? It's going to change because electric vehicles and so on anyway. So big changes, but maybe at this point, I can bring in my colleague, Ana Diaz from the Plum Bonds Initiative, who's going to talk about guardrails. And I should just say for those people who arrived late, I'm Sean Kidney. I'm CEO of the Climate Bond Initiative. This is a webinar on bioenergy and the inevitable policy response modeling on this. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. If you want to ask a question, please do ask questions. We'll take them as we go as much as possible. And we'll introduce our speakers as we go through. Anna Diaz, over to you.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you, Mark and Jason, for this thoughtful and comprehensive report. And thank you so much for putting all this relevant information together. It's very useful for us working from the other side of the models to get all this clear and transparent information that we can use. As you will know, our organization, the Climate Bonds Initiative, aims to drive global capital to support transition across sectors. So we do this by developing standards for each sector, which financials can use to certify projects. During the last 6 months, I am leading the work of developing criteria which define investment in the power sector. Thus, deliver the transition to net zero and are though in line with the Paris Agreement. So I'm happy to see how easily and natural IPR guardrails have been included in our bioenergy electricity production criteria. And this is what I want to develop a bit more, if I am allowed, in the next few minutes. So for us, including biomass into the electricity sector, we have taken into consideration 5 main pillars. You already say, so criteria for indirect land use change, criteria for food security, criteria for defining the type of biomass that we are going to use as a feedstock, criteria for transportation and processing the biomass, and also BECS, so the carbon capture and storage for biomass. As you can see, all of these have been already mentioned in your report, which that's why it's very useful. First, we are very much aware that truly sustainable biomass is limited in volume. As Mark and Jason just mentioned it at the presentation, there are around 30 hectajoules of potential supply of waste and residual feedstock that minimally compete for land. We can see from literature, and I have looked for some data, how this volume raised from 30 to 50 hectajoules annually, but also we can see how the IEA net scenario can also reach 100 hectajoules per annual. So meaning that biomass has to be used where it's more sustainable than the other generation technologies as more and more competitive. So this is the framework. For building the criteria, we have quantitatively integrate the 5 pillars that I mentioned before in terms of embedded emission per unit of energy of biomass. I will explain that. So this has been possible thanks to life cycle analysis approach, where we have taken all these 5 pillars and calculate all the emission that they produce in the transportation process, hardness, and it gets into the power plant. So we know how much emission are embedded into this kilojoule of biomass that we can use to produce electricity. As can be seen in the literature, this life cycle analysis approach, and this is key for bioenergy, can range from a minimum of -1,000 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour to a maximum of 1,300 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, with an average of 100 grams per kilowatt hour. And this is the largest range for our renewable sources, imply that a great risk for sustainable management of biomass. This is compared with other renewable sources when you can see, like for solar or wind, the average is about 50 grams per kilowatt hour, and the range goes from 10 to 100. So this is key. There is a huge risk in doing things wrong with biomass, and this is what we try to avoid with the criteria. The implication of this wide range is that there must be the threshold for the use of biomass, and this is what we are building with the criteria. Applying to the land use chains, this includes emission from carbon stock chains caused by land use change. So this is the land use change tracks changes in the carbon content of soil and vegetation that occur to the land use change, so such as deforestation, where forest is converted into agricultural land, or land management, such as good harvest, where forests remain forests based on spatially explicit data. We are also including some caveat for including so that will include avoiding natural displacement, deforestation, food competition, and irrigation that happily are also included in your model. Defining the type of biomass that can be used is also key. So we will allow only lignocellulosic material. This is what you have called second generation biomass at the IRP report. So biomass supplies will include agricultural residuals, organic municipal waste, and forestry industrial residues. This second generation excludes the emission from the extraction of cultivation of raw material that are mostly allocated into the first generation. So this is why we included this part of the biomass, the second generation. There are some caveats for the use of energy crop in terms of degraded land and irrigation issues, as you also mentioned. So we have also included, and this is key, transport and processing of biomass. This includes emission from transport and distribution of the biomass, as well as emission from processing the biomass. Transport is key to the sustainable management of biomass, which must be avoided over long distance. So this is a way to introduce this variable into the approach. And finally, BECS, so carbon capture and storage. We have some milestone in terms of the use of carbon capture and storage for bioenergy. First, because of the usual low efficiency of biomass power plants and the penalty that carbon capture technologies impact on power plant efficiency. So this is the first point, is key. The efficiency of the power plant operated by biomass is usually lower than for the fossil fuel. So we need to keep that in mind. And secondly, in terms of the capture rate, so biomass has been proposed as a co-firing solution for coal-fired power plants. And in this case, the younger coal-fired power plants that will be in operation for at least the next 20 years, biomass co-firing appears to be a fair solution that tries to minimize emissions from plants that will be in operation for a long time. To summarize, we have set a life cycle analysis threshold for the use of biomass for electricity production that includes all the 5 criteria mentioned. This is a threshold in terms of emission embedded into the biomass per energy unit. So it will be gram of CO2 per kilojoule of biomass that can be very well correspond with emission embedded per biomass per energy produced. So that will be grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour produced. Thank you so much.
Hey, a hell of a lot happening in terms of modeling now. And now we turn to Lee from BNP Paribas Asset Management. Lee has a particular singular role here, which is representing BNP Paribas Asset Management. But I've said to him, representing what investors are thinking. BNP Paribas Asset Management is one of the larger asset managers on the planet, but also one of the most forward-thinking. They have, what I'm going to say in terms of climate, an exemplary sustainable finance policy, one of the better ones around, and have a lot of engagement in bioenergy issues, or at least, Lee, that's what I've heard. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. That's a very generous introduction, and thank you for this great report and all the insight from it. If I'm to put my investor hat on, I can probably help provide 2 things. The first is probably just a high-level perspective around what drives our appetite to make an investment. And then the second is just what we're seeing on the ground with possibly a few numbers. So in terms of high-level thinking, for our investments, whether it's solar, wind, hydrogen, biofuels, whatever, we typically need to consider a very general Venn diagram of 4 different spheres where the potential suitable investment sits at the intersection of those spheres. So first sphere is it a sustainable investment? So does the company provide environmental solutions or products that help enable the energy transition? And do any of its activities do any significant harm? And this comes up quite often where we see oil and gas companies, transitioning their business models towards, say, more biofuels, which is great, but their legacy business still does significant harm. And perhaps alternatively, from a land use perspective, I guess a key consideration would be if a first generation biofuel company, say producing ethanol or ethanol from corn or sugarcane, whether that follows as the best farming practices or is considered to do environmental damage. So that's sphere 1. Sphere 2 is what is the growth potential? This needs fairly limited explanation. Investors want to invest in growing sectors. So you need to think about how well suited a biofuel is for a sector. Is biofuels in power generation going to grow as fast as, say, solar or onshore wind? Probably not. But the story does change a bit when you start looking at very niche, regional, say, waste biogas applications or SAF. Sphere 3 is, what is the return potential? So biofuels is a great example of a technology where the science is there. We can transform biofuels into almost any energy source because it's got a very similar chemical structure to fossil fuels. It's mostly hydrogen, mostly carbon. So you hear about biofuels for your car, biofuels for plastic, biofuels for planes, biofuels for stoves, biofuels to ship your Amazon parcel across the sea. But the reality is that most of these are not economically competitive compared to alternatives. And we need to look at the different returns for different technologies to make an investment. And then fourth sphere is, what is the risks? So this feeds more into individual company business models alongside the macro environment. The largest risk for biofuels, I would say, is the industry's dependence on government policy to be successful. And what happens if the government change their mind? A key example of this is if you look at Sweden. Sweden is one of the largest bio and renewable diesel consumers in Europe. And earlier this year, they backtracked on their biofuel mandate, which dictates the percentage of biofuels that they must have in their transport system. And the math for that was quite simple. Lower mandates is lower costs. So cutting the blending mandate allowed consumers to shave off 25% on their fuel bills. And that's for a country that's facing continued rising costs of living. But this has large implications to nearby biofuel producers where they need to consider where their volumes will go. So as investors, you need to feel comfortable with long-term government policies like blending mandates, like putting a price on carbon, and like incentivizing production through credits and penalties. So that's the sort of general investment thought process. In terms of what we're seeing on the ground, I guess first takeaway is that investment generally follows policy in biofuels. On the policy side, Europe and the US are pretty much very aligned with what's been presented today. Preference is basically strongly towards prioritizing biofuels that come from waste, don't compete with land, and have very low carbon intensity. Generally, a very good way is to think of the US and EU as, say, carrots and sticks. The US is generally a carrot. It provides incentives to produce biofuels. So that's through the Inflation Reduction Act, through California's low carbon scheme, through Renewable Fuel Standard, versus the EU is more of a stick. So they mandate certain biofuel obligations. And if you don't meet those obligations, there's a penalty. And that's through acts like Repower EU and the Renewable Energy Directive. So if you just consider an example in the US, if you own a renewable diesel plant today, that is, you take either the soybean oil or animal waste, and you essentially produce renewable diesel from that, which is a drop-in substitute for normal diesel, you're currently making a loss of around $1 a gallon. So for each gallon you produce, you're losing $1. And that compares with someone who currently produces crude oil, who makes a profit. And why that is because, biofuel waste costs more to source and to process. Try thinking about trying to source thousands of tons of animal fat and trying to run that through a refinery. It's pretty hard. So the question comes is how do you make up that $1 deficit? So either consumers need to be willing to pay a premium for that product, which is quite hard with cost of living, or the government needs to support that through a subsidy, and that's what the US has been doing. And that direction is pretty standard among developed countries. If you look more towards developing countries, preference is currently still towards first-gen biofuels, I would say. If you look at Brazil and India, a lot of their decarbonization strategy is pinned around increasing the blend of biofuel, mostly ethanol, into gasoline. And that's still good. Ethanol generally has a lower carbon intensity than gasoline, but there's still an argument around, how this will impact land. You can only increase your yield so far, and there will come a time where you eventually need to cultivate more land. So I guess that there's my summary for you, Sean.
Lee, that's a great segue to Tanya, who's going to talk about land and competition issues. But one thing you told us, which is important for our listeners to understand, which is investors, or at least one investor, and I can say there's a lot of investors here, are interested in this topic. We've seen the growth of green investing, the green bonds market that we're associated with, which is now above $3 trillion outstanding from $2 billion when we started, is an example of proof of concept that investors will invest. It's not just green bonds, it's all sorts of areas. The appetite to marry investment opportunities with, let's call it, lower risk pathways to the future, as in climate investment mitigation, is there. The question is what qualifies and how do we do it and how do we address some of these contradictions, which is why this report is so important to inform the discussion, to inform the thinking on the part of investors going forward. But on that note, Tanya, land and competition, yikes.
Great. Well, thanks very much. So again, the initial kind of drive behind this work is to analyze the competition for land from many different sectors. And I don't think it's been mentioned earlier in the conversation, but IPR uses a model called MAGPIE that tells us essentially, based on our policy forecasts, what will be the highest dollar value per available acre as an indicator of how it'll be used. And then our policy work prices in some of future environmental and social externalities. And these are the guardrails or the constraints, if you will, on potential commercial uses. And you saw that there's not that much land available for biofuels once you account for the guardrails. And you also heard that there are plenty investable, sustainable investment opportunities that exist that don't actually need land, where bioenergy is really a solution for waste, with energy being a valuable product, and compared to where it's a solution for energy, and there may be other solutions that are more sustainable, with notable exceptions, as people said, around aviation, pulp and paper, and so on. And then in terms of the investment universe, of course, in a global concept of land, we have to think about ag tech, clean tech, nature tech solutions that ensure optimization of land kind of regardless of its ultimate use. So I think there's plenty of hunting opportunities there for investment in space. But also, since I'm meant to cover land, I wanted to remind us that land has another ask on it, other than commercial use that we can price or public good. And now what I'm saying now reflects really my own views. Land use must be considered not only within planetary boundaries, but national borders that have been, in most cases, established through violent military confrontation and uncomfortable political solutions. And these borders are not always appreciated, recognized, or respected. An example is Russia's authoritarian government troops and their mercenaries invading Ukraine, terrorizing it, and cutting the world off of critical resources of grain and of fertilizer and other resources on Ukraine's rich soil. And this is what happened when Hamas terrorists attacked Israel, and we have yet to see any impact on Israel's assets, such as its innovation to protect land and nature, like alternative protein, water salination, and as it happens, 12 bioenergy startups that are launched in Israel. And so I just want to, this is a very strange thing to be doing for a webinar like that, but I just want to take a moment, because it's too traumatic a situation not to mention this in a conversation about the importance of land and competition for it. Geopolitics are incredibly important in this conversation, a consideration, very much a consideration within the inevitable policy response for near-term as well as longer-term issues. And I'd like to just pause for a bit and send thoughts of empathy to for the deep and pain that folks have, thoughts of reaching some sort of peace sooner rather than later, some sort of hope for a necessary, if evasive, political solution that can protect the innocent victims who did not elect and have not supported their current leaders on either side, and some of whom are being held hostage literally or figuratively by these leaders' agenda. I'll pause there. I'll put the bioenergy startup universe from Israel on chat, just because I think it should be useful for the topic, and I'll stop there.
Thanks, Tanya. No comment. I want to go back to the broader issue of how we go through. We need a panel discussion now, really, about how to go forward and what's happening. Now, clearly, there are investment opportunities. Lee's been telling us that. We know there's appetite going forward, but how do we actually institute these changes, drive the change going forward? What does IPR say about how this is going to happen? What are the likely changes? We heard a bit of a hint earlier with the need for governments to address some of these guardrails and some growing appetite, particularly in US and EU, to do it. We've already seen the IRA in the US drive lots of the Inflation Relief Act, Inflation Reduction Act, drive lots and lots of investments in this and related areas going forward, although it's very early days for impact. Maybe I can go back to you, Mark, just to kick us off here. What are you saying in IPR about how this kind of scenario is going to be delivered? What can people look for in terms of clues that it's actually going to happen?
Well, I think, you know, we tried to lay out some, and Lee laid out some. I think, you know, I'm actually going to rely on the IPR theory, which is the inevitability of people eventually doing the right thing. Now, that's some people will say, well, good luck on that one. But I think in the environment, in the end, with stumbling backwards and forwards, we generally tend to go, you know, in the right direction eventually. And I think that's the point that Lee makes, is that if you, in this space, if you don't think you're going to face policy at some point, perhaps, and I'm saying going what I would call in the sustainable direction, then you could find yourself in a very difficult situation where you've invested in something and the rug gets pulled out from under you. So I suppose I'm an optimist to the extent that I feel that you know, it is inevitable that we try and protect the planet, lurching around as we do, because the implications are too dire. And biodiversity, I mean, we spend a lot of time talking about climate impacts, but when we did our biodiversity study, I have to say the potential damage to the economies and the environment and the whole way we live from a loss of biodiversity is astounding. I mean, it's just a shocker. And, you know, and so what are we going to do? We really expect everyone to sit here and grow endless amounts of biofuels to compete with food, to force food prices up, to compete with the forest, to destroy national habitat? I wouldn't bet on it if I was an investor.
And it's certainly true that the biodiversity discussion, what do you do about nature conversation, is becoming mainstream, which is fantastic. Not that we're seeing the action that's required yet, but at least in rhetoric, and especially amongst finance. I mean, Lee, with your colleagues at BNP Paribas Asset Management, this has been a topic that I've been discussing for some time. And every event we go to now, as in a conference and so on, biodiversity on the agenda, the IMF's got a big, strong biodiversity push at the moment and so on. So let's just say noise is building. Action will happen in that area. So there is going to be pressure on land. And we, you know, I think the other thing to just remind people on this listening is that I think it's close, you might correct me, Jason, but we've got close to 80% of agricultural land around the world is devoted to protein production or feedstocks for protein production. And if we think about that, and we think about the extraordinary unsustainability of allocating such a large slab of the planet to rampant meat consumption.
Sean, don't start us on bovine emissions, which is one of our big findings. Essentially, 5 gigatons of emissions in the second half of the century. It becomes the dominant source of emissions after the energy system's cleaned up. And wow. So we have a joke, you know, it's direct air capture for cows.
It is a crazy planet we live in. When you start looking at these sorts of figures and numbers, clearly we are going to have to reallocate land globally to nature to be able to rebuild biodiversity, because we're going to get a century of severe shocks of various kinds. We're going to stress our ecosystems drastically and dramatically. We've got to make them healthier. That's going to be not only supporting the existing ecosystems, but a level of turning back land that we have decimated in the last 50 years in particular.
And again, it sort of goes back to this point about why things will happen. The economic loss from biodiversity, the World Bank, Jason, help me, the World Bank estimated it as some phenomenal number, right?
I don't remember the number off the top of my head either, but it was, but it does, when you look at some of the tipping points on the nature transition and things that might, as the World Bank estimated, could start to kick in by the end of the decade and into the 2030s. Yeah, you're talking about something that was of the same magnitude of some of the climate physical risks. So it is very significant by that estimation. That's right. And the other thing I would say, you asked about what would, what is it? We talked a lot about the kind of policies regarding sustainable fuels that are important to steering this, and perhaps steering it in different directions. And Lee highlighted, some of the risks that we've already seen manifest in places like Sweden, where a shift in policy, whether it's driven by cost, whether it's driven by sustainability, whether it's driven by the availability of other alternatives, can significantly move a market in this way. But in addition to that, I think there's a couple of other things to point out. I would just reemphasize that the FPS does see significant shifts in diet. And those shifts, actually do enable, to some extent, bioenergy to still fit into the system. And I think one of the things that we need to see, if we're going to have even the limited but important bioenergy economy that we lay out in FPS, one of the things you would need to see is some of these dietary shifts enable, repurposing of land for food crops, enabling repurposing of land for other uses, including nature. The other thing I would say is, of course, as this ties in the land system in particular, NBS and nature-based solutions, if you're going to see a transition in which it's more profitable to restore nature and to sequester carbon, given existing stocks, you have to have the supporting policy to do that. And FPS also does see that broader system shift in terms of supporting policy towards NBS unfolding. So bioenergy is deeply interrelated to many shifts in the economy. And so while it's important, of course, for investors to look at the direct sustainable fuel support policies, it's relative competitiveness and the factors that are pressuring one direction or another, go as far as policies for EVs, as far as policies for meat consumption, as far as policies for NBS.
And by the way, the model that Jason talked about, FTS, is underpinning the inevitable policy response. Just to explain the acronym. If you want to read more about this, just type in inevitable policy response into your search engine, and you will get a wealth of information about this. And everyone who's on this thing will, at least connected in Zoom, will get the PowerPoint sent to them, or links to the PowerPoints afterwards. So there'll be material coming to you.
And Sean,
Mark, go ahead.
Just a quick advert. We've produced a blog summarizing all of this, which was distributed in LinkedIn, and we'll push that out again in the next couple of days, just as a sort of a summary of this.
Of course, and Mark, might be good to put that in the chat just to make it really easy for people. But listen, we've got to wrap up. So I'm after sort of final comments about where this is going from Anna, Tanya, Lee, and Jason, and Mark. So Anna, reflections of the conversation so far, where this is going. Anything to add?
Well, I really saw a shift from the important role that bioenergy plays in the past in the global energy modeling, and now is getting less and less because it was not sustainable. Mark mentioned that, but I think this is key. So we can see really a shift. Now the last net zero emission scenario from the IEA was launched, the update 2 weeks ago. It just give like 4% of capacity for electricity production to bioenergy and 1% of BECCS. So this is really something that we can consider within the framework that we can live with, and then we can start thinking that this is really in line with what we're expecting that for bioenergy. So this is happening. I think this is something that we are seeing. And I could not be more agree with what you just say. So let's look for a new future where we can see this happening in terms of the bioenergy use for electricity, which, by the way, is also useful in terms of security, supply security, and the services for the grid. So, but we need to allocate the forces pretty much.
And that allocation is one of the challenges that this report really highlights. Tanya?
Yeah, I want to pick up on the point that Sean, you and Mark were talking about with the conversation about beef. Because as Mark pointed out, in IPR, we're basically seeing beef emissions stay put between now and 2050, while emissions from other sectors decline. Therefore, beef emissions, even after deforestation has ended, represent 20% of total global emissions by 2050. And simply because they're staying put and the rest is withdrawn. And while that presents an opportunity for bioenergy, ironically, because as we've said, waste residues are kind of safe feedstocks from a land use perspective. The animal that is producing that wonderful feedstock occupies enormous amount of land. And you also noted, it takes up, over half of all of the grains and everything else that the world produces, especially soy, really. So apart from the bioenergy concept, I really think it's important, and IPR makes this point in highlighting beef as the kind of the last emission standing, if you will, to really think about what we can do to accelerate the diet shifts, to accelerate development of new types of substitutions, and to otherwise look at that as a very specific segment that has not really gotten the attention that it deserves.
Really good point, Tanya. And we've got a team working on catalytic changes in agriculture and land use, including protected agriculture. It's worth noting, just for our listeners, that we're seeing some interesting developments here. The city-state of Singapore has a target of producing 30% of its food by 2030 on its own landmass, which is essentially urban farming. And that includes protein or protein substitutes. And that means they're investing. They're amongst a pile of investors that are going into protein substitute, urban farming at the moment. There's actually a huge amount of capital floating into the area. We're going to see something happen in that area. We expect to see a substantial slab of food generation move to urban farming. This isn't really something Mark and I have had a lot of time to talk about, and it's early days because we could be wrong. But at the moment, if you follow the money, there's certainly something amazing happening there, which gives us a couple of huge opportunities. One is it gives us an opportunity to divert from animal protein to other forms of protein and plant-based stuff. It might also give us an opportunity to shift animal protein generation to urban farming rather than vast land use farming. Whatever, freeing up land, it's got to be an outcome of this sort of conversation for other activities. So there's a few interesting things to happen. None of these, of course, are mature investments that are ready for Lee to invest in at BNP Paribas Asset Management. At least I don't think so, but maybe Lee, it's a good time to cue to you.
Yeah, I think ending remarks, it's always nice to end on a few positives. I think first positive for me is that, general understanding about biofuels is typically quite high, especially from policymakers that I've seen, which is quite surprising. And that's thanks to reports like this, I guess. Second positive is that, as you say, Sean, biodiversity is becoming top of mind for investors. And, some companies that do harm regarding biodiversity will lose out on certain investment because of that. Versus in the past, maybe that wasn't the case. And the third is that nature-based solutions will become vital, especially if we overshoot the 2050 target. We will need technologies or solutions that extract carbon back from the atmosphere, and we can't just rely on direct air capture to do that.
Absolutely, Jason. You've been in the weeds of modeling this for as long as I've known you, and you're now at McKinsey's in the big engine of change. well, I don't know if I'm still allowed to call you part of Vivid, but you know, the history is you're now part of McKinsey's. Can you tell me your level of hope with this model and what you're seeing in the models? I mean, I want to give people an idea of someone who's really caught up in the weeds, the modeling, how they're seeing the future.
Yeah, I mean, Mark mentioned a bit of it earlier, but I think what one reflects on after a decade or more of this kind of stuff is how much we can see, tipping points and new technological and/or policy pathways, radically transform markets. And in this particular instance, it's moving in and across to the bioenergy space, right? So we talked about EVs and how EVs have just totally changed what you would think of as the opportunity for bioenergy in fundamental ways. There's things that you can expect in kind of a long horizon, of course, which I think is what FPS focuses quite a lot on. But these things can move very fast. And, our perspective, say, on bioenergy will have shifted significantly in the last 5 years, as you've seen policy catch up with sustainability requirements in a quite a rapid way in the last, few years. And as you've seen alternative technologies create new pathways. So, I guess the reflection is that I think there's a lot of hope in the ability of these rapid tipping point changes. And there are risks. And certainly the bioenergy views over the last 5 or 10 years reflect both of those.
Mark, a final word.
Well, as I say, hopefully it is indeed inevitable we shift in the right direction towards sustainability with the backwards and forwards that you will see over time. I would say that, we can see how you can get to a 1.8 peak in emission in temperatures, not over 2. We're much more optimistic in that sense in our forecasts. So some people say, oh, why aren't you at 1.5 at the peak? Well, yeah, that's hard for us to see, but it's not 2.5 at the peak for us. So we see, as we're calling it, the temperature corridors are narrowing, actually. 1.5 is disappearing. 2.5 plus is disappearing as policy accelerates. We've been about 1.8 for a while, and we do think these negative emissions technologies can bring us down ultimately back towards the 1.5. And I think, as Lee said, NBS, we have a lot of NBS in our forecasts. I mean, another 4 gigatons of NBS. So, the combined DAC and NBS is a very big number. And if you don't get that, then you're going to be, really, on current trends, even with the view that policy will forecast, you've got a big challenge on your hands. And land is all over that. Land is such an important element of how that will all play out. So I'm optimistic. I think we are optimistic and realistic. I think we're on a good path, but there's still a lot of challenges.
And Mark sums up beautifully. Essentially, 1.5, as I start off this conversation today, saying, is lost. We're not going to stop it. But as the inevitable policy response outlines, 1.8 back down is what we're looking at now. That's why we need to maintain the 1.5 targeting, even though the temperature will go up before it'll go down again. It is possible. The IPR shows us how it's going to happen, but there's a lot of work to be done in all sectors and all segments. I urge you, encourage you to look at the full inevitable policy response report. Simply search online for it. In the meantime, in the bioenergy space, you've got a feel today of what the future looks like here. There are some areas are simply not going to be part of the mix, realistically, inevitably. There are some areas that will be part of the mix and the solution, which of course are areas to invest in, like sustainable aviation fuels, for example. In the meantime, we've all got work to do to create a sustainable future for ourselves, for our children in rapid time. Good luck to everyone, but above all, good luck to the panelists, and thank you for being here today to share your thoughts. Anna, Tanya, Mark, Jason, Lee. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.